Hi, good evening. It's Thinking Slow Group. We wanted to do a video about risks of myocarditis post-vaccination. We have quite a few sort of topics piled up. Another big one we wanted to do in the next few days is about non-COVID deaths after dose one, which is truly mind-boggling figures. But because this is about a very important topic now, which is sort of in full swing at the moment, we thought we'd walk you through quite an important paper recently that's talking about myocarditis risk, or actually more widely, cardiac adverse events for teenagers post first dose and then post second dose of vaccine. And this is potentially quite important. It's on the channel we're on is not so keen on having these discussions, so we're going to be quite careful here and stick more or less to the text of the technical paper, which hopefully will mean that this will stay up. So this is the paper that we're essentially looking at just now. There's a link at the bottom of it, and the purpose of this paper is to compare the risk of cardiac adverse events to the risk of being hospitalized with COVID-19 for a particular age group, which we'll go into, but it's basically the 12 to 15-year-old age group and the 16 to 17-year-old age group. So, the beginning of this is, thankfully, COVID-19 has very, very small chance of fatality for children, which is a huge mercy, obviously. In the NHS database for England, there have been 9 deaths throughout the whole pandemic over the last 1.5 years without comorbidities, and the actual base that's from is all children in the age group 0 to 19, which is 13.3 million. And the 9 deaths are from a total of 48. The others were with comorbidities, so it's difficult to say what was the actual cause, but 9 we know for sure was just from COVID. But with such a big cohort, that's actually, I hope you can appreciate, not a big number and not a huge risk. And we all know that the risk to children, luckily, is relatively low from this disease. Now, what else we know is that the UK government's been ahhing and ahhing about vaccinating teenagers and what the recommendations are about that. And this committee, JVCI in the UK, has been sort of unfortunately going slightly backwards and forwards with some recommendations, and recently sort of came out something that was quite vague. You couldn't really get a clear sense of what they were saying, which is why I think this paper is important, because it gives some very clear signals about what they found based on data from the relative risk of myocarditis, or actually cardiac adverse events, compared to hospitalization with COVID. So I'm going to go into the methodology, but there's basically 2 important numbers. These two here, 162 cases per million, which is the number of cardiac adverse events for 12 to 15-year-olds boys, and 94 per million for the slightly older age group of 16 to 7. And what they do is they compare the risk of cardiac adverse events in these 2 categories with the risk of hospitalization. And the answer they come out with is it's not a small difference of a few percentage points here and there, but these risks are 10 to 20 times higher than COVID-19 hospitalization over a 120-day period. And as I mentioned, they're pulling the base data out of the CDC's Wonder database, which is the database of adverse reactions to vaccines. It's sort of publicly accessible, and they've explained the methodology of which events they pull out of the database. And they basically split this 257 into boys and girls, and by first dose vaccine, second dose vaccine, and then into the age categories 12 to 15, 16 to 17. So this number is split into 8 sort of different groups, and each group has its own size of population. So there'll be one size of population for female teenagers 16 to 17 who have had 2 doses of vaccine. That will be a predefined group, and they've managed to find the size of that group and have said, okay, if 10 of these 257 events were in that group, then you take 10 and you divide it by the group size, and that's your risk of a cardiac adverse event for that group. So you have 8 of those numbers, and the 2 we're going to focus in on are the boys in the 12 to 15 and 16 to 17 after 2 doses of vaccine. I think that's the most relevant group. And those numbers then are compared to the risk of COVID hospitalization. The risk of COVID hospitalization is taken from the CDC database that publishes weekly figures on hospital admissions by age group for COVID. And then from that weekly figure, you can work out what the risk is over a 120-day period. So this is what they end up with, and I'm going to try and explain as best I can what this is showing. But these are the chances of hospitalization from COVID-19 over a 120-day period. This is no comorbidities, so these are healthy individuals, and they go into 3 bars because you have 3 sort of seasons of hospitalization. This is the peak season around January, this is the low season around July, and then I think this is the figure for August. So you can see here that the risk of getting hospitalized with COVID-19 for sort of people with no comorbidities is very much lower than the myocarditis numbers or cardiac adverse event numbers for this age group 12 to 15 for boys. And the numbers are actually, this is 13 times lower, so from here to here is 13.7, this is 3.6, and this is 2.6. So critically, we're not talking about a few percentage points here and there. We're talking about orders of magnitude, basically, which then also makes that advice from the UK committee slightly odd, that it's all very finely balanced, and they can't make any definitive statements, because looking at this, it's pretty definitive, basically, for this group without comorbidities. It's just truly dangerous to be taking a vaccine to avoid this risk of hospitalization compared to the risk of cardiac adverse events. And it's essentially the same story for the slightly older group, which is boys 16 to 17. They have a slightly lower risk of cardiac adverse event post first dose and second dose vaccination. This is post second dose vaccination, but even though it's slightly lower, it's still massively higher than the risk of hospitalization from COVID-19 over a 120-day period. So I hope that basically makes sense, because that's what this chart really is all about. I'm going to say a few words about this next group of columns. This one essentially is saying that these hospitalizations, 40% of those, although they're COVID hospitalizations, they're saying as an illustration, you assume that 40% of these hospitalizations, COVID was incidental. So 60% were actually for COVID and 40% were for something else, but COVID was recorded as an incidental diagnosis. And that's not an unreasonable assumption. We've been looking at this number in the UK, and it can actually be much higher level of incidental COVID, can be easily up to half or more. So this is not an outlandish suggestion that actually your risk of being hospitalized for COVID itself is much lower because the CDC data is including hospitalizations with COVID rather than for COVID. But anyway, what that obviously means is if you push down the risk of hospitalization by 40%, then you get a much higher sort of gap between the risk of myocarditis or cardiac adverse events and the risk of hospitalization. I've put the multiples up here. So this is 22 times more risk of cardiac adverse event than being hospitalized with COVID-19 over a 120-day period. So, again, this is not like borderline plus minus. This is night and day differences in risk levels. And they've said in their paper, to be fair, that doesn't apply for everybody, because if you have comorbidities, you have a much higher chance of being hospitalized. Here, roughly, the ratio is somewhere about 5, it's about 5. So this doesn't hold for all cases, basically, but it does hold for no comorbidities. It's a sort of absolutely night and day decision. The risks from cardiac adverse events post second dose vaccination are massively higher than the risk of hospitalization based on this study. And here it's a bit more finely balanced. So for example, this is now with comorbidities, but then as you're again assuming 40% reduction where COVID's incidental. So in the low season, July, the risk of cardiac adverse event is still much higher. In the mid-season, it's sort of balanced, and then avoiding this risk, this would make sense. That in the peak season, it would make sense to avoid this risk by having the vaccine. You're avoiding a higher risk than the risk you're taking with a cardiac adverse event for this age group. But even then, it's finely balanced here. So hopefully that makes sense about what this paper is actually saying. I wanted to make a couple of important caveats from what I can see from this, although I'm not a medic by any means. But the things that occur to me were that we're only looking here really at cardiac adverse events, and that's 257 events from all adverse events in the database for this age group is 20,000. So there's many more things in the system than those 257 events related to myocarditis. So in a way, we're saying that the risks post-vaccination could be many-fold higher because we're only looking at a small group, that 257 things from 20,000. So if anything, I would say the risks post second dose vaccination for this age group would be higher than you saw here, 162 and 94. That again is just based on cardiac adverse events. So potentially that number is going to be much higher if you start adding in other serious adverse events, basically. But that's just a sort of afterthought, really. And what's going to happen next? Essentially, I think we've been given the signalling from our corrupt and dishonest politicians is that they're going to push ahead with this anyway, even though the sort of evidence, even from the own committee, is sort of finely balanced. It's sort of sitting on the fence, unfortunately, but the paper actually makes clear that the evidence for those cases with boys with no comorbidity is night and day, that they shouldn't be doing this. But they're going to push ahead anyway because we'll go into why that is and what the agenda is. And they're also now starting to talk about a very scary prospect, which is this Gillick competence, where children potentially have the right in this age group, 12 to 15, to decide for themselves what they want to do, and potentially to overrule their parents on this one. So if this if the medical practitioner decides that the children are competent, they can override their parents, and that is very scary because obviously at this age they're going to struggle going through all these numbers and understanding what the relative risks are. And I think most disturbingly of all is the NHS is targeting a very, very underhand campaign, FOMO it's called, fear of missing out, which is basically teasing in a way children with, you can't go to the disco, you can't do this, you can't go with your friends, all you have to do is get the shot and life is back to normal. It's a very despicable campaign, and it's being targeted at this age group, and they've already announced that, in the case of a disagreement with the parents, they're going to go for Gillick competence. So this is very, very bad, and as I said, I don't think children are going to be in a position to go through even the numbers we've just been through and understand what the risks are and how they're calculated. And even this UK government committee ended up sitting on the fence, but it danced around the issue, and it never really was able to get a firm conclusion. So the idea a school child would be able to do that is really phenomenal. And for all those people who will basically push this and are pushing this, and again, they're not going to be doing that by going through all the numbers we've just been through. There's still a criminal offence in England of battery, which is basically a medical intervention. Well, here it is, without valid informed consent. And the key term is informed consent. They would have to know all about the myocarditis. They would have to know about the risks that they're basically averting, whether they have comorbidities and not comorbidities. That has a big impact on the COVID risk. All of that really would have to be explained. So, if the NHS thinks it's just going to go ahead and push out a fear of missing out campaign and coercing teenagers into having this, and that'll be the end of it, then they're wrong, because there'll be people that will come and stop that. So then, just wrapping up, essentially, the numbers don't stack up for a lot of vaccination of teenagers, and then you get into this quite scary wider considerations language that we've seen from the bureaucrats. That basically means they know the data is against them, and they get into this kind of vague ideas of maybe something else somewhere else, or there's some society level ideas that basically override the fact that the data points to this being a dangerous and unnecessary intervention for teenagers, especially boys without comorbidities. And when you get into that kind of thinking, you're into a totalitarian mind system where the interests of the system are paramount, and even to the point where the lives and health of the individuals are going to be sacrificed. This is dangerous, dangerous thinking. It only ends in one way, and it ends very badly. So all those people pushing this wider considerations, they should be aware that they do not have the right to cause harm or put children in harm's way for some kind of dystopian plan that they have in their minds. And again, if that's going to happen, I'm sure there'll be people opposing that and putting a stop to it. Eventually, it might take time, but eventually, yes. And then the last thing, just closing up on this, are, we have to also be aware that there are agendas, and there were agendas on having mass vaccination right from the get-go of this COVID pandemic. So already in March, actually, or March and April, the Gates Foundation was coming out with statements that 7 billion people need to be vaccinated. Now, they weren't alone. There were plenty of the usual globalist suspects like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and his friends, basically looking to transfer money up into UN organizations, pooling resources to buy vaccines and busily deciding how to vaccinate the entire planet. Now, in this little example here, the teenage boys, 12 to 15 and 16 to 17, it's clear that they don't need this vaccine, and this has never been part of their agenda. The agenda for these globalists has always been 7 billion people. The whole world is going to get vaccinated, whether they need it or not. So that is the kind of juggernaut that some of us are standing in the way of. We're saying this doesn't make sense. You can apply the same argument to natural immunity. If you've had COVID and recovered, you don't need this thing. But these people are going to push it for everybody, no matter what, no matter risk, no matter logic. This is what they want, basically. This is a juggernaut. So, don't be nervous about standing in the way of these people and saying no, because they're already miles beyond their sort of constitutional rights. They're miles beyond any kind of Nuremberg Code considerations. And absolutely everybody has the right to say, no, you do not have the right to impose this on me or anyone else. You cannot create risk for people that don't need that risk. It's just unacceptable. And don't be swayed by the sort of, that's selfish. It's not selfish, it's common sense. If you give up your rights, then these people will take them and use them. That's as simple as that, basically. So I think that was the main message today, as we like to say at the end of every video. Don't stay safe, but stay free. And the only way to stay safe is to be free, because if you give up freedom, which is kind of where we're heading now, you're not going to be safe. So hopefully you found this interesting, and I have another very, very interesting video about deaths, non-COVID deaths coming up, which hopefully will be out this week. Thank you very much. If you enjoy this, please subscribe, please share it with other people, and please put on a like, otherwise this is all wasted effort. Thank you very much. Goodbye.